Hello and welcome to the third devlog for my still unnamed Voxel RPG game. I was pretty productive the past week and lots of interesting things have happened, so sit back and let me tell you about them. My goal for this week was to continue the improvements I had made to the exploration screen from previous weeks. I had a coin effect which I liked a lot, but wanted more flashy, entertaining things to make sure that the game was interesting. My main goal for this week was to have proper models rendered in place of the really boring buttons I had there before. I already had lots of the infrastructure necessary for this, as I had set up the render windows in the previous weeks for cases like this. Now, when it comes to rendering models to the UI, there are two approaches I can think of. The first is rendering the meshes to textures and then displaying the textures in the user interface as standard widgets. This is actually what I do for something like the player in the combat screen. The second is just rendering the meshes onto the render window I placed at the top of the layer stack. Given how I'm using an orthographic camera for all this, there wasn't any projecting, meaning it's pretty easy to line things up. I went with this approach as I felt it was more likely to be performant when compared with some of the other solutions. The problem with rendering as textures is that I can't just have a single texture per model, as that would kill performance. There is a possibility, however, to render multiple items to a single texture and then just cut out the bits I need per GUI widget. However, that's far more complicated and would ultimately produce the same effect, so I went with just rendering icons on the top for now. I created a manager to keep track of these objects, as well as a class to encapsulate all the logic. This owns the scene nodes and knows how to align the meshes in 3D space. Remember, I have to make sure that the coordinate systems match up perfectly for this, in order to make it look right. I was able to get this working with a few raycasts, and was pleasantly surprised to see it actually worked as I expected. So this grey cube in the middle is rendered by Ogre, and these two bits on the side are just panels, so they're to showcase what's going on. They fit and align perfectly with the box itself, so that's great because that is, it's the coordinate systems working together. One thing I did have to address was the issues with models intersecting one another. Sometimes, when lots of effects are on the screen, things often ended up colliding together. This led to scenarios where things didn't really look correct. Fortunately, this was resolved pretty simply as I'm using an orthographic camera. I could just drop the Z position backwards, with no visible change in render, as orthographic cameras don't include perspective changes. While this is great, it's also another reason why it would be hard to switch to a perspective camera if I did decide to do that, as this approach would never work. From here, I made a model for my coin pouch item and worked to get it rendered alongside the other items. As much as it looked pretty rough, it showed lots of promise. I was able to animate the models to make them look more interesting, although noticed some coordinate issues with it. Objects were never aligned to the center properly, which was really annoying. I worked out that this was an issue originating from the model coordinates themselves. They were never quite center as a result of the export process, and this issue has actually been there all along. Luckily though, as I had done it right and automated my entire export system, I could just subtract 0.5 from the vertice positions in my Python script. Now models were centered properly, rotated properly, and looked lovely. Taking the time to improve my code, I wrapped the buttons and the render icons into a single object. This will allow me to do more interesting things with the found items than just a button. For instance, better animations and more elaborate text placement. Previously it was just that the exploration items container managed everything to do with the buttons. And remember, the button encompassed the label as well. Now that I'm having render icons, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to separate it into its own class. So it actually looks worse than what I showed you last time. But what you can see is when stuff arrives, there's no animation because I haven't figured that out yet. But you see that the item appears on top of the button, and when you click it, it actually disappears this time. With this, I was able to get the animations to return as they had previously, this time with the render icons now in place. With all my rendering infrastructure in place, I wanted to create more models for the different items. However, I was confronted with an issue that I mentioned last week. I did not have enough colours. I had constrained my colour palette to a texture, but this meant I was limited to my palette of just 32 colours. I only had a single yellow colour, so my coins ended up looking rubbish as a result. I came to the conclusion last week that this wasn't enough when trying to make a convincing coin model. In truth, it's not enough, frankly. I only had a single yellow colour, so my coins looked rubbish as a result. I worked around this by inserting my intended colour into the palette generator script, but this was obviously a workaround.
But you are seeing fake yellow.
Instead, I switched to one of the other colour palettes provided by Voxel, the Magic of Voxel palette, which ironically is from a competing voxel tool. This palette provided 256 different colours, so I'm able to fully saturate an entire byte with the options. Attempting to get this set up in my project, I immediately ran into some errors with it. Again, I had automated the creation of the palette, so just had to slot the new colour values in. However, for some reason everything was red. Spending some time pulling my hair out, I eventually found the source of the issue. In order to speed up the voxel conversion script, remember I had to convert hex colors to texture coordinates. I was hashing the color values for faster lookups. And when I say hashing, I really mean I just added the RGB values together to get the hash value. This worked fine and was nice and simple for a palette of 32 colors, but with a large palette it produced collisions. This explains why everything was red, as the red colors appear earlier in the palette, so Python just returned that for everything. I solved this by shifting some bits in the colors, not quite as efficient as summing, but that's the price you pay for excess size.
Humongous.
After some time painstakingly converting my old models to the new colour sets, everything looked the same, but my palette was now way bigger. Finally, I was able to go about making more models for the game. I made some models for the health potions, and in doing so solved some issues presented by models with disproportionate width and height. I was only checking for width of the model in relation to the button, which obviously wasn't correct, especially for certain models. But with some fiddling, I was able to get it looking good. Continuing the theme of improving the looks and animations, I began adding my first set of particle effects to the screen. You can see this when the item arrives from the world. It's just a few planes animating for a few seconds, but I think it adds a lot. One thing I was not happy about, however, was the way the buttons looked in general now that the models were there. I played around with trying different approaches to this look, and found that it looked nicer without the buttons in the background. It looked clearer and gave more opportunity for custom effects later on. Obviously the user interface skins needed a redesign, but that will come eventually. With a few days left before the end of the month, I wanted to get more particle effects in place. I built a quick effect where the particles come from the centre, but this took way longer than I expected due to architectural reasons. Effects were not responsible for their own lifespan. This was fine for short effects like previous, but meant that switching screens with effects running for instance was bad. I had to build a system to properly shut down effects on screen switch, as well as added the concept of persistent effects, which animate until they're destroyed. I'm not fully sold on this effect yet, but this sort of thing is a gradual process. I also ran into a real edge case relating to how I was managing my basic data types. The values were completely wrong, the particle effects were all over the place. So the issue is, this is a problem with scripts, is that I pass this object through, it ends up here, where it's, where is it? So it's collected here and turned into this box center, and then you see down here you do some computation on it. So I do various things, I take it away, but you can see here in this case I have bottom left equals box center. So there's two different assignment operations. There's actual assignment, so it creates a copy of the object, and then there's the other one where it just creates a reference to the object. So actually what's happening here is that it's just creating a reference to the box center object. And you can see here that it becomes bottom left, and then here we start taking values away from it. So this is not a copy, this is actual box center, so what I'm saying is box center minus equals box center.x. And what that then means is that when I get back here to try and pass it off to this thing, well, the value is all completely screwed up because it's not a copy. In order to fix this, I simply added a function to the engine which allows you to create a copy of my basic data types, rather than just a reference. That's it for the main features this week, although there are still some miscellaneous things to mention. Firstly, I'm improving my debug options. I can now specify to disable encounters and force certain items from the setup file. This means I don't have to keep some awkward workarounds in the code. The other major thing which I'm so happy about is that the blinking issue is now fixed. You might remember it from some previous episodes, but it was causing a display to blank out for some time and was generally driving me insane. For the x-axis might be fine, and this blinking's doing my head in. This only happened after I updated my MacBook to macOS Ventura. I tried to fix it myself, but when that didn't solve it, I eventually decided that I would do the ancient tactic of wait and see if someone else fixes it for me. The thing was, it didn't occur on iOS, which really spooked me out. I knew it would be something that I could spend hours trying to track down, so just stuck with the workaround in the meantime. This tactic actually paid off, however, as some massive lads on the Ogre forum got the same issue and fixed it themselves. It was completely just an Ogre issue, and a one-line fix was all it took. But I never would have had the time to find that for myself. One thing I will say though is that my quality of life has improved immeasurably after it was fixed. So that's all I got done this week. Some of it was just back-end code stuff, but there's also some interesting visual work here. I still don't have models for all the items, but think I'll get into the habit of doing code during the day and then modelling in the evening, as I can just switch my brain off while making models. Hey, it's been a little while since I've done one of these, so I thought we'd just have a chat. I'd like to let you know of the current plans for the project and the channel as a whole, and where I feel I am with all that sort of thing. So I think progress on the game has been going quite well so far, and I'm keen to sort of lay out what my plan is for the rest of the year. So I think for the year, what I would like to say is that my goal will be open beta by the end of the year. So when I say that, that might just be me dumping an exe file onto some GitHub releases page somewhere, or it might be something more coherent, a Steam release or something like that. But I do want to have something playable for you, the viewers, by the end of the year, because I think that would be a solid time to be able to do that. I think what I'd like to get is some player feedback so I can kind of gradually drip feed those changes back into the project. I think really that player feedback is going to be quite invaluable for a project like this. So I've come up with a plan for the next few months. So firstly, let me just read that out to you. So for March, I want to focus on procedural generation and the world itself. The world I currently have in the exploration screen is extremely boring and it's essentially just a placeholder. I want to have proper stuff arriving before the player, and of course I want to make that all as procedural as I possibly can. That's something I haven't really touched on much before, so I'm looking forward to be able to do that. I think in April I want to plan and tie things together with the new approach to exploration. So I essentially want to try and get exploration good enough to the point where it's playable and it is actually fun. I think in May I want to fix the issues I have with the kind of level design approach. So remember, there's procedural content in this game, and then there's also static level design stuff, and they kind of mix together. So I need a proper way to design levels, and the way I did it previously, where I just made a model in Voxel, is obviously not going to work, and that's been obvious for a long time. So I need to have a proper think about how I'm going to do that. In June then, once I've got that, I'm going to focus on the content frameworks, so being able to make world scenes, add items, enemies, and just general things like that, miscellaneous things. So for instance, being able to save the game. I want to focus on the fundamental blocks of the game itself, the foundation, before I can actually go off and start mass producing content later on. In July then, I think improvements to combat is probably a good idea. Combat as it is at the moment is really just sort of like it's there, again, placeholder. I think you can understand how it will work, but it needs improvement. I think in August then, with the assumption that everything, the main bits of the game are all sort of there in their fundamental foundational state, I will then be able to look at things like art style. So that will be kind of making sure the models all look the same, and there's no irregularities, and just generally making sure that things look good. And that would include button skins, logo design, whatever, all that stuff. Then in September and October, I've really just budgeted in content. So that doesn't necessarily mean anything in particular, really. I think I want to focus on having stuff in the game, so that could be story content or characters or whatever. But I'm gonna have to reach a point where I sit down and actually add stuff to the game. So I think that's a good time to do that. And of course, leaving 2 months as kind of these slack months is a good idea actually, because it's likely that some other stuff will get delayed, because that happens, doesn't it? I think, again, approaching the idea of a public sort of beta towards the end of the year, what I'm then thinking about in November is that I want to make sure that things are optimized and I sort of iron out any of the bugs or issues with the game itself. So there's a few different things I need. I think from an engine perspective, I need to ramp up my automation a bit, because I need to... It's things like automated builds. I don't have that at the moment, and I've been meaning to have that for a long time. So I would like to have that. That's sort of going to be invaluable for actually releasing a game with the engine. So, and on top of that, I also need to budget in time for the Android support, because currently I don't have that. Well, it's sort of not really finished. And finally in December, I've just left December as a blank, prepare for beta release month. So really that could be anything. I'm making sure to build some slack into this schedule though, because from my experience, things always take longer than you think they will. But at the same time, I think that is a decent plan for where I would expect to be at the end of the year. I sort of want to have a fully sort of featured game, but I think the thing I'm going to sacrifice in those initial months is actual story content. So the story content I imagine will come later on. What I'm expecting is that I'll probably still be working on this game come next year, and I'll maybe continue for a few months, 3, 4, 5, however many months. I don't want to work forever on this project, but I do want to make sure that I have something that makes sense and has actual decent story content in it. So my thinking is, this year I will focus on the foundational aspects of the game, make sure everything is fun, and then the next year it will really just be writing dialogue and modelling and making places and all that sort of thing, with the assumption is that all the technical aspects are working underneath. Yeah, that's how I imagine it. For any of you who watched my first video, you might remember that I actually mentioned in that video that I was going to be going off to do a year abroad in Japan. So let's just talk about that for a moment. After quite a bit of consideration, I had a think and decided that it wasn't actually really what I wanted anymore. Now that might seem to kind of come as a surprise. I had actually planned this trip for quite some time, prior to actually starting this channel. It was about 2020 I decided that I was going to do it. Now of course the pandemic didn't help with that, and this is kind of part of the problem I came across. So I was going abroad to do a language course, and I was actually be learning Japanese. I did it as an optional unit at university and kind of enjoyed it. So for me, what I decided back then was, as a career move, I would go off and try and actually finish the language and get it nailed down and all that sort of thing. This is something that I thought I wanted for a long time, but when it came closer to the actual day, I think I realised that really my priorities had actually changed. I really just kept pushing it off and off because, of course, pandemic and that sort of thing. When I quit my job, I was working under the assumption that I would be doing that kind of first and foremost. But I think it also led me to reevaluate a bit why I was actually doing the course in the first place. I think having worked on this project for so long, I was sort of hesitant to actually take that step and say I'm working full-time on it. So what you have to remember is that if it's a hobby project and it doesn't work out, well, it's a hobby project, and you can just say, well, yeah, it was never really intentional. Taking that step and kind of making it public and putting it out into the world, and people will judge it based on the actual merit it has, rather than me just being able to say, well, it's an incomplete hobby project. I'm essentially trying to make something that really represents kind of the best of my ability, and in a way that's sort of a difficult step to take. I think part of the reason I was interested in doing this year abroad was because it was really just more time to delay the inevitable of actually working full-time on the project, and really that was not necessarily the best idea. This was also compounded by the fact that if I was going to be going abroad to work for a year, I would have to do things like schooling, exams, and just general life stuff, which that is another step altogether. Because of course you've got to think about the things that they don't necessarily tell you about, like grocery shopping, going out and doing things, culture shock. Yeah. One thing I'd like to stress is that I'm a believer that you can do anything you actually set your mind to, but I think at the same time it's also a matter of priority. What do you want to achieve more than other things? And in order to achieve those initial things, you sort of have to sacrifice other stuff. You can't do everything. So I wasn't really afraid of any of the difficulty of actually going there. In fact, I kind of enjoy a challenge, but I just think I would prefer to stay here and do this. I don't feel like I can work on the project productively when I'm living abroad and doing other stuff. If it was just me going there as a tourist, not to do a student course, then it would be different, because I think I'd be able to do my work during the day and then do whatever I wanted in the afternoon. And the thing is, I would quite like to do some travelling. I haven't really done any. And I know you sort of have to do it when you're young, sort of. As always, I think really time is the enemy, and you have to be aware of that when doing these sorts of things. It's a matter of, what do I want more than anything else? And what I realised was that really I just wanted to keep hammering on with the work I've been doing so far. I'm quite pleased with what I've got so far. And I do actually believe quite strongly that I can make this work. So the TLDR is essentially that I'm not going anymore. I've decided that I'm going to stay in the UK, and I'm going to keep going with this. And with that, I've rambled over. I hope you're interested in what I've outlined and the project going forward. I'm quite excited to be able to work on this stuff. I know that next month I'll be doing procedural generation, which is something that I've wanted to do for a long, long time. So I'm really looking forward to be able to do that. So I hope to see you in the next one, hopefully. Bye.